It is June 21st, 1942, and somewhere in the darkness of Long Island's Atlantic coastline, 4 men are crawling through the fog like ghosts from another world. The air is thick with salt spray and the smell of wet sand. The surf pounds against Amagansett Beach with a rhythmic violence that seems to shake the earth itself. These men are soaked to the bone, shivering not just from the cold Atlantic water that clings to their skin, but from something else, the electric fear of what they're about to do. They wear civilian clothes now, but underneath, buried in waterproof bags along with blocks of TNT, timing devices, and incendiary pencils, are German naval uniforms. If they're caught in those uniforms on American soil, they're prisoners of war. If they're caught in civilian clothes, they're spies, and spies hang. 21-year-old Coast Guardsman John Cullen is walking his patrol route, same as he does every night, thinking about nothing more complicated than breakfast and whether the fog will lift before dawn. He hears voices carried on the wind, German voices. Then, out of the mist, a figure emerges. The man speaks English, but with an accent. He's nervous, too nervous. He offers Cullen money, first $70, then $300, to forget this encounter ever happened. Cullen, unarmed and alone, takes the money and backs away slowly into the fog. He runs back to the Coast Guard station, his heart hammering in his chest, and tells his superiors what he's seen. By the time they return with rifles and flashlights, the beach is empty, except for a pile of hastily buried explosives and German cigarettes scattered in the sand, like evidence of a fever dream. What John Cullen stumbled upon that foggy night was the opening act of the most ambitious enemy operation ever attempted on American soil, Operation Pastorius. 8 Nazi saboteurs, trained by the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had been sent to cripple America's industrial war machine from within. Their targets included aluminum plants, hydroelectric facilities, railroad terminals, and key bridges. If successful, the operation could have delayed American war production by months or even years, potentially altering the course of World War II itself. But within 2 weeks, all 8 men would be in FBI custody. 6 would be executed. And the reason for this catastrophic failure wouldn't be American counterintelligence brilliance or coastal security. It would be one man's conscience, one man's doubt, and one spectacularly stupid decision that would save countless American lives. This is the story of how Nazi Germany tried to bring the war home to America, and how the operation collapsed, not because of what the saboteurs did wrong, but because of what one of them did right. To understand Operation Pastorius, you have to understand the peculiar position Germany found itself in by early 1942. The war was going badly. After Pearl Harbor, America had entered the conflict with its vast industrial capacity intact and its determination absolute. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping in the Atlantic at a terrifying rate, but everyone knew this was a temporary advantage. Once American factories hit full wartime production, once the sleeping giant truly awakened, the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat would become undeniable. The Nazi leadership understood this cold arithmetic better than anyone. They needed to slow down the American war machine, to buy time for German scientists to develop wonder weapons, for German armies to consolidate gains in the East, for something, anything, to change the trajectory of the war. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the enigmatic chief of the Abwehr, proposed a solution: sabotage. Not massive bombing raids that Germany lacked the strategic aviation capacity to execute, but something more subtle and potentially more devastating: a campaign of industrial terrorism conducted by men who could blend into American society, who spoke English fluently, who understood American culture. The challenge was finding such men. They needed to be technically competent enough to handle explosives, ideologically reliable enough to be trusted with such a mission, and American enough in their knowledge and manner to avoid detection. The answer came from an unlikely pool: German nationals who had lived in the United States, who had worked American jobs, walked American streets, and then returned to Germany. Some out of economic necessity, some out of political conviction, some simply because they were caught in Europe when the war began. The Abwehr identified potential candidates and brought them to Quenz Lake, a secluded estate outside Berlin that had been converted into a sabotage school. There, under the supervision of Lieutenant Walter Kapper, a former German-American Bund member who had lived in the United States for years, the recruits learned the dark arts of industrial destruction. They studied the chemistry of explosives, the mechanics of timing devices, the vulnerabilities of American infrastructure. They practiced building incendiary bombs disguised as lumps of coal that could be slipped into factory furnaces. They learned how to recognize key structural points in bridges and railway systems. They memorized the layouts of aluminum plants and hydroelectric stations, and they absorbed a peculiar kind of tradecraft, not the glamorous espionage of code breaking and dead drops, but the grim practicality of how to burn down a warehouse or derail a train while making it look like an accident. Among these men, one stood apart, George John Dasch. 39 years old, Dasch had spent nearly 2 decades in America before returning to Germany in 1941. He had worked as a waiter, lived in New York City, and absorbed American culture so thoroughly that he thought in English, dreamed in American slang, and considered himself more American than German, despite his birth in Speyer. Dasch was ambitious, verbose, and prone to grandiose thinking about his own importance. He saw himself as an intellectual, a man of destiny, someone who could shape history rather than simply participate in it. But beneath this inflated self-image ran a current of genuine doubt about the Nazi regime he was supposedly serving. He had witnessed the brutality of the Third Reich firsthand, had seen the casual cruelty and the ideological rigidity that allowed for no dissent, no nuance, no mercy. Alongside Dasch were 7 other men, each with their own histories and motivations. There was Ernest Peter Berger, who had once been a member of the SS, but had fallen out of favor and saw this mission as potential redemption. There was Heinrich Heinck, a skilled machinist who had worked in American factories and knew their vulnerabilities intimately. Richard Quirin, Herbert Haupt, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, and Edward Curling rounded out the group men of varying competence and commitment, united only by their German heritage and their willingness, or at least their inability to refuse, to participate in this operation. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. 2 teams of 4 men each would be transported by U-boat to the American coast. One team, led by Dasch, would land on Long Island. The other, led by Curling, would land near Jacksonville Beach, Florida. They would disperse into American society, establish themselves in various cities, and over a period of 2 years, conduct a systematic campaign of sabotage against key industrial and transportation targets. They were given $84,000 in American currency, a fortune in 1942, along with explosive materials, detonators, and detailed target lists. They were also given something else, the knowledge that if captured, they would almost certainly be executed as unlawful combatants. On May 26, 1942, the first team boarded U-boat 202 in the French port of Lorient. The submarine was cramped, reeking of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, vibrating with the constant throb of engines. For 16 days, Dasch and his 3 companions lived in this claustrophobic steel tube, eating canned food and breathing recycled air while the U-boat navigated across the Atlantic. They slept in shifts, fought off seasickness, and contemplated what awaited them on the other side. Dasch, in particular, spent those long hours wrestling with his conscience. He later claimed that even before the submarine left French waters, he had decided to betray the mission and surrender to American authorities. Whether this is true or merely a self-serving narrative constructed after the fact, remains one of the great unanswered questions of Operation Pastorius. What is certain is that by the time U-202 surfaced off the coast of Long Island on that fog-shrouded night in June, George Dasch had already begun to sabotage the saboteurs. The landing at Amagansett Beach was supposed to be smooth, professional, and completely undetected. Instead, it was a comedy of errors that would have been laughable if the stakes hadn't been so catastrophically high. The U-boat surfaced in heavy fog approximately 400 yards offshore, much closer than planned, because the submarine commander wanted to minimize the time his vessel spent vulnerable in shallow water. The 4 saboteurs Dasch, Berger, Heinck, and Quirin climbed into a rubber raft with their 4 wooden crates of explosives and supplies. They paddled toward shore through the cold Atlantic surf, their hands already numb from the frigid water, their civilian suits soaked through despite the waterproof bags they wore over them. When they reached the beach, they immediately realized they were in trouble. The fog was so thick they couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. They had no idea exactly where they had landed. No clear sense of geography or orientation. They dragged their crates up onto the sand above the high tide line and began the process of burying them, working quickly, frantically, aware that dawn was approaching, and with it, the possibility of discovery. They were still digging when John Cullen appeared out of the mist like an apparition. The encounter between Dasch and Cullen lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but in those 5 minutes, the entire operation began to unravel. Dasch first tried to bluff, claiming they were fishermen who had run aground. Cullen, who could see quite clearly that these were not fishermen and that there was no boat, remained suspicious, but unarmed and outnumbered. Dasch then made his first critical error. He offered Cullen a bribe, first $70, then $300, an enormous sum that only confirmed Cullen's suspicion that something deeply illegal was happening. When Cullen finally backed away into the fog and ran for help, Dasch and his companions finished burying their supplies and fled inland toward the Amagansett train station. They were still wearing damp clothes and reeking of seawater when they boarded the 6:57 train to New York City. 4 German saboteurs, looking like drowned rats, carrying bags full of cash, sitting in a Long Island Railroad car with American commuters heading into Manhattan for a Sunday morning. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked questions. The greatest enemy operation on American soil was rolling into the heart of New York City in broad daylight, and nobody saw a thing. In Manhattan, the 4 men checked into separate hotels. Dasch went to the Governor Clinton Hotel, where he registered under his own name. Another stunningly careless move that suggested either overconfidence or something else, some deeper plan that even his fellow saboteurs didn't know about. For the next several days, Dasch behaved very strangely for a man on a secret sabotage mission. He made no effort to establish cover employment. He made no contact with potential collaborators or underground Nazi sympathizers. Instead, he spent his time arguing with Ernest Berger about what they should do next, pacing his hotel room, drinking heavily, and apparently working up the courage to do something that could get him killed either by the FBI or by his own Abwehr handlers. Meanwhile, 400 miles south, the second team was landing near Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Their insertion went more smoothly than the Long Island landing, but not by much. Edward Curling, Herbert Haupt, Hermann Neubauer, and Werner Thiel came ashore without incident, buried their explosives and German uniforms, and made their way inland. They dispersed to various cities, Chicago, New York, and began the process of establishing themselves, finding apartments, buying clothes, trying to blend in. Haupt, who had been born in America and grown up in Chicago, had the easiest time of it. He simply went home to his parents' apartment and told them he'd found a way back to the States. The others had more difficulty. But within a few days, all 4 men were successfully embedded in American urban environments, practically invisible among millions of other civilians. Back in New York, George Dasch was having what can only be described as a psychological crisis. The man who had been trained to destroy America's industrial infrastructure was instead sitting in his hotel room, chain-smoking, drinking whiskey, and arguing with Ernest Berger about whether they should turn themselves in. Berger, who had his own complicated history with the Nazi regime, was sympathetic but cautious. Dasch, however, was becoming increasingly agitated, increasingly convinced that surrendering to American authorities was not only morally right, but also his ticket to becoming a hero, perhaps even a celebrity. In his grandiose imagination, Dasch saw himself not as a traitor, but as a double agent, a man of conscience who would be celebrated by both the American government and, after the war, by a reformed German state, grateful that he had prevented pointless bloodshed. On June 14, 1942, Dasch made a phone call that would change everything. He called the New York field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and told the agent who answered that he had information about German spies on American soil. The agent, dealing with what he assumed was yet another paranoid crank call. The FBI received hundreds of such calls every week in the febrile atmosphere of wartime America, was dismissive. Dasch, frustrated, decided to take more dramatic action. He bought a train ticket to Washington, D.C., checked into the Mayflower Hotel, and called FBI headquarters directly, demanding to speak with J. Edgar Hoover himself. What Dasch didn't know was that the FBI was already looking for him. John Cullen had reported the beach encounter immediately, and Coast Guard personnel had recovered the buried explosives and German uniforms from the Amagansett dunes. The FBI knew that German saboteurs had landed on Long Island, but they had no idea how many there were, where they had gone, or what they were planning. Bureau agents were combing hotels and train stations, showing sketches based on Cullen's description, following up on hundreds of tips and sightings. It was only a matter of time before they found Dasch and his companions, but time was exactly what nobody had. If the saboteurs successfully went to ground and began their campaign of destruction, the damage, both physical and psychological, could be immense. On the morning of June 15th, George Dasch walked into FBI headquarters in Washington and spent the next 8 hours telling agents everything. He named all 7 of his fellow saboteurs. He described their training at Quens Lake in exhaustive detail. He provided the addresses where they were staying, their cover identities, their target lists, and the locations of buried explosives. He laid out the entire Operation Pastorius with the thoroughness of a man desperate to prove his value, to demonstrate that he was not just a snitch, but an intelligence asset, someone deserving of gratitude and protection. The FBI agents listening to this confession could scarcely believe what they were hearing. Here was the biggest counterintelligence windfall in American history, delivered gift-wrapped by one of the conspirators himself. Within hours, FBI agents were fanning out across New York and Chicago, arresting the saboteurs one by one. None of them resisted. Most seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the impossible tension of living undercover in enemy territory had become unbearable. By June 27th, less than 2 weeks after the initial landing, all 8 men were in FBI custody. Not a single act of sabotage had been attempted. Not a single bomb had been planted. The most ambitious enemy operation ever attempted on American soil had been completely neutralized before it could even begin. The question of what to do with 8 Nazi saboteurs captured on American soil presented the Roosevelt administration with both an opportunity and a dilemma. On one hand, the capture itself was a tremendous propaganda victory, proof that American counterintelligence was vigilant and effective. On the other hand, there was the very real concern that a civilian trial might take months, might reveal sensitive information about FBI methods, and might even result in acquittals if clever defense attorneys could exploit technical legal loopholes. Attorney General Francis Biddle and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover both recommended military tribunal, arguing that the saboteurs were unlawful combatants who had entered the country in secret with the intent to commit hostile acts during wartime. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt agreed. On July 2nd, 1942, he issued Presidential Proclamation 2561, which declared that enemies who entered the United States to commit sabotage or espionage would be subject to military law and trial by military tribunal. The 8 saboteurs would be tried not in civilian court with all its constitutional protections, but before a panel of military officers who could impose sentences up to and including death by execution. The trial would be held in secret, in the Department of Justice building in Washington, with no press, no public gallery, and no appeals beyond a direct petition to the president himself. The trial began on July 8th and was, by any standard, a foregone conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had the buried explosives, the German uniforms, the money, the detailed confessions. They had John Cullen's eyewitness testimony. They had documents recovered from the saboteurs describing their targets and methods. The defense attorney's military officers appointed to represent the accused did what they could, arguing that the men had never actually committed any acts of sabotage, that some had intended to surrender from the beginning, that the military tribunal itself was unconstitutional. But the 7-member military commission was unimpressed. Day after day, the prosecution laid out the case in meticulous detail: the training at Quens Lake, the submarine journey, the landings, the abandoned plots to blow up hydroelectric stations and railroad bridges and aluminum plants. George Dasch testified at length, portraying himself as a hero of conscience who had masterminded the mission's failure from within, who had always intended to betray the operation and thereby save American lives. Ernest Berger supported this narrative, claiming he too had planned to surrender from the outset. The other 6 saboteurs told different stories. Some claimed ignorance of the full scope of the operation. Others said they had been coerced or misled. One insisted he had only returned to America to see his family and had never intended to participate in sabotage. None of these defenses mattered. The commission saw 8 men who had entered the United States by stealth, wearing enemy uniforms concealed under civilian clothes, carrying explosives and detailed plans to destroy American infrastructure. The intent was clear. The evidence was incontrovertible. On August 3rd, 1942, the military commission announced its verdict. All 8 men were found guilty. All 8 were sentenced to death, but the commission also made recommendations for clemency. George Dasch and Ernest Berger because of their cooperation and their role in exposing the plot, were recommended for reduced sentences. Roosevelt reviewed the recommendations and commuted Dasch's sentence to 30 years in prison and Berger's to life imprisonment. The other 6 men Curling, Haupt, Heinck, Neubauer, Quirin and Thiel would hang. The executions were carried out on August 8, 1942, in the electric chair at the District of Columbia Jail. The 6 men went to their deaths without ceremony or publicity. No reporters witnessed the executions. No photographs were taken. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves in a potter's field. It was as if the Roosevelt administration wanted to erase not just the men themselves, but the very fact that enemy agents had successfully landed on American soil. The official announcement of the executions was brief, clinical, offering few details and no names. The message was clear. Operation Pastorius had failed completely, and those responsible had paid the ultimate price. But the deeper truth of Operation Pastorius was more complicated and more disturbing than the tidy narrative of vigilant American security and swift military justice suggested. The fact was that 6 men had died, at least in part, because one man, George Dasch, had betrayed them. And while Dasch portrayed himself as a hero of conscience, there were others who saw him as something else entirely. A coward who had lost his nerve, a fool who had doomed his companions to save himself, a narcissist who had imagined himself playing a great role in history and had instead become a footnote marked by shame and controversy. In the immediate aftermath of Operation Pastorius, the Roosevelt administration and the FBI took a very public victory lap. J. Edgar Hoover appeared in newspaper photographs, accepting congratulations for the Bureau's supposed brilliance in tracking down and capturing the saboteurs in record time. Press releases emphasized the efficiency and alertness of American counterintelligence, the impossibility of enemy penetration, the futility of Nazi attempts to bring the war to American shores. What these releases very carefully avoided mentioning was that the entire operation had been blown wide open, not by FBI detective work, but by the voluntary confession of one of the saboteurs himself. The truth about George Dasch's role remained classified for years. The FBI, for obvious reasons, had no interest in publicizing the fact that their greatest counterintelligence triumph had essentially walked through their front door and announced itself. To acknowledge Dasch's cooperation would be to acknowledge that without his confession, the saboteurs might have successfully dispersed and operated undetected for weeks or months, potentially carrying out devastating attacks on American infrastructure. It would be to acknowledge that American coastal security had failed, that the FBI's initial response had been dismissive and incompetent, and that pure luck and one man's crisis of conscience had prevented a disaster. George Dasch himself spent the next 6 years in federal prison, growing increasingly bitter and disillusioned. The hero's welcome he had imagined never materialized. Instead of gratitude, he received a prison sentence. Instead of celebrity, he got obscurity. The American government, he felt, had betrayed him, had used his information and then discarded him like a piece of trash. He wrote letters to newspapers, to government officials, to anyone who would listen, insisting that he had saved America and deserved recognition, not imprisonment. Few people were sympathetic. To most Americans who even knew the story, Dasch was just another Nazi, guilty by association if nothing else. In 1948, President Harry Truman granted executive clemency to both Dasch and Berger, commuting the remainder of their sentences on the condition that they be deported to the American occupation zone of Germany. Dasch left prison expecting to return to a Germany grateful for his principled stand against the Nazi regime. Instead, he found himself in a country devastated by war, where former Nazis were either lying about their pasts or being prosecuted for war crimes, and where nobody wanted to hear about the complex moral calculations of a man who had betrayed his compatriots to the enemy. In Germany, Dasch was seen as a traitor. In America, he had been seen as a saboteur. He belonged nowhere. For the remaining decades of his life, George Dasch lived in obscurity, working menial jobs, writing an unpublished memoir that nobody wanted to read, and nursing his grievances against both the American government that had imprisoned him and the German society that had rejected him. He died in 1992 at the age of 89, having spent 50 years trying to convince anyone who would listen that he had been a hero, not a traitor. Whether he succeeded is still a matter of debate. Some historians see Dasch as genuinely conscience-stricken, a man who recognized the evil of the Nazi regime and chose to act against it despite the personal cost. Others see him as an opportunist and a coward who saved his own skin by betraying men who trusted him. The truth, as is so often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. What is indisputable is that Dasch's decision to walk into FBI headquarters fundamentally altered the course of Operation Pastorius. Without his confession, the 8 saboteurs would have dispersed across the country with $84,000 in cash, detailed target lists, and training in demolitions and covert operations. Could they have successfully carried out attacks on American infrastructure? Almost certainly. The United States in 1942 was a vast open country with minimal internal security. Industrial plants, bridges, railroad terminals, and hydroelectric facilities were largely unguarded. A determined saboteur with technical expertise and patience could have caused tremendous damage. The aluminum plants alone, critical for aircraft production, were vulnerable to attack. A successful sabotage campaign might have set back American war production by months, might have cost thousands of lives in air battles over Europe and the Pacific, where American pilots would have lacked the aircraft they needed. On the other hand, it's also possible that the saboteurs would have failed on their own, that internal disagreements and incompetence would have led to their detection regardless of Dasch's betrayal. Some of the 8 men were clearly out of their depth, poorly trained, emotionally unprepared for the isolation and danger of operating behind enemy lines. Herbert Haupt, for instance, immediately returned to his family in Chicago, making himself conspicuous. The group's security was terrible. They carried large amounts of cash, failed to establish proper cover identities, and communicated carelessly. Perhaps the FBI would have caught them anyway. Perhaps informants or lucky breaks would have exposed the plot. But we'll never know, because George Dasch ensured that the question became moot. The legal aftermath of Operation Pastorius extended far beyond the execution of 6 saboteurs. The case went to the Supreme Court in the case of ex parte Quirin, where defense attorneys challenged the constitutionality of the military tribunal and the denial of habeas corpus. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the president had the authority to order military tribunals for unlawful combatants, establishing precedent that would be cited decades later in debates about Guantanamo Bay, military commissions, and the legal status of terror suspects captured during the War on Terror. The ghost of Operation Pastorius, it turned out, would haunt American jurisprudence for generations. In the grand sweep of World War II history, Operation Pastorius is barely a footnote. It didn't change the course of the war. It didn't shift the balance of power or alter strategic calculations. Most Americans today have never heard of it, and even among those who have, it's remembered primarily as a curiosity, an interesting what-if scenario that never quite materialized into anything consequential. But this dismissal misses the deeper significance of what happened in June of 1942. Operation Pastorius mattered because it revealed the vulnerability of the American homeland. Despite 2 vast oceans, despite the protective buffer of geography, despite the apparent impossibility of enemy forces reaching American soil, Nazi saboteurs had successfully landed on 2 American beaches and penetrated into the heart of American cities. If they could do it, others could too. The fact that the operation failed was, in large part, a matter of luck. The luck of John Cullen being on patrol that foggy night. The luck of George Dasch's crisis of conscience. The luck of the FBI taking his confession seriously rather than dismissing him as a crank. But luck is not a security strategy. The operation also mattered because it forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty and belonging. 7 of the 8 saboteurs were German immigrants who had lived in America, worked American jobs, and been part of American communities before returning to Germany. How many other German Americans might harbor divided loyalties? How could you tell a loyal citizen from a potential enemy agent? These questions, which seem paranoid and ugly from the perspective of our own era, were very real concerns in 1942. The internment of Japanese Americans, one of the great stains on American history, was driven partly by this same logic of doubt and suspicion. Operation Pastorius seemed to confirm the worst fears about immigrants from enemy nations, even as it also demonstrated that individual conscience and personal choice mattered more than ethnic heritage. But perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Pastorius is what it teaches us about the nature of courage and betrayal. George Dasch betrayed 8 men who had trained with him, traveled with him, and trusted him. 6 of those men died because of his decision. Was he a hero or a traitor? The answer depends entirely on your perspective. From an American viewpoint, Dasch saved lives and prevented sabotage, making him at least a valuable intelligence asset, if not quite a hero. From a German viewpoint, he violated the most fundamental military code, loyalty to your comrades, making him a contemptible traitor. From Dasch's own viewpoint, he was a man of principle who chose conscience over orders, who recognized an evil cause and refused to serve it regardless of the personal cost. What makes Dasch's story so haunting is that he gained nothing from his decision. He was not celebrated or rewarded. He spent years in prison, decades in bitter obscurity, his whole life shadowed by the sense that he had done something important that nobody appreciated. In his own mind, he had saved America, and America had responded with imprisonment and deportation. Was he right to feel aggrieved? Perhaps. But it's also true that Dasch's decision to confess was shaped at least partially by self-interest, by fear of being caught, by the calculation that betraying his companions might save his own life, by the narcissistic fantasy that he would be treated as a hero rather than a turncoat. Pure motives are rare in espionage, rarer still in betrayal. The stupid mistake of Operation Pastorius, if we want to boil it down to a single moment, was not tactical or strategic. It was psychological. The Abwehr had selected men with connections to America, men who spoke English and understood American culture, without fully considering that those same connections might create divided loyalties. They had sent George Dasch, a man who had spent nearly 20 years in New York, back to destroy the country where he had lived most of his adult life, and they had apparently never considered that he might identify more with America than with Nazi Germany. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to understand that identity is fluid, that belonging is chosen as often as it is inherited, and that sending someone to destroy a place they once called home is a psychologically complex proposition that requires more than just training in explosives and a bag full of money. In the end, Operation Pastorius failed because one man made a choice. George Dasch, for all his flaws and mixed motives, chose conscience over orders. He chose what he believed was right over what he had been told to do. That choice saved American lives, prevented industrial sabotage, and ensured that the most ambitious Nazi operation on American soil would end not with explosions and chaos, but with arrests and executions. Whether that makes Dasch a hero, or simply a man who happened to be in the right place to make the right choice at the right moment, is a question that history has never quite answered, and probably never will. What we can say with the clarity of hindsight is that sometimes the course of history turns on individual decisions rather than grand strategies, on conscience rather than competence, on what one person chooses to do when nobody is watching and the stakes are impossibly high. Operation Pastorius reminds us that wars are fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with choices and consequences, with the internal struggles that happen in hotel rooms and over telephone lines, where the real battles are psychological and the outcomes are never quite what anyone expected. And perhaps that's the final lesson, that the most dangerous enemy is often not the one who lands on your beaches with explosives and plans, but the one who makes you question whether security is even possible, whether vigilance is enough, whether the protection of geography and oceans and borders can ever truly keep danger at bay. Operation Pastorius failed, but its shadow succeeded. It made America realize that the war could come home, that the homeland was not invulnerable, and that sometimes the only thing standing between safety and catastrophe is one person's decision to do the right thing, even when that decision costs them everything. The fog has long since lifted from Amagansett Beach. The buried explosives are museum pieces now, the wooden crates and timing devices displayed behind glass as curiosities from another era. But the questions that Operation Pastorius raised remain as urgent as ever. How do we protect ourselves from enemies who look like neighbors? How do we balance security with liberty? And what do we owe to those who betray their own side to protect ours? George Dasch spent his life trying to answer those questions and never found satisfaction. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some questions aren't meant to be answered, only contemplated, carried forward through history as reminders that courage and betrayal are sometimes the same act seen from different angles, and that the difference between hero and traitor is often nothing more than which side of the line you're standing on when judgment comes.